Debbie, thank you so very much for that introduction. And what a crowd. It's wonderful to see so many people here tonight. It's a thrill to be back in Kankakee. I haven't been here, I would say, for about a quarter of a century. But it was a great drive down from Deerfield, Illinois, which is home for me. And as I say, I'm so very pleased to see so many smiling faces. Hopefully you'll still be smiling after my presentation. So as Debbie said, I'm here on behalf of the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center, which is located in Skokie, Illinois. Have any of you ever had the opportunity to visit? Wow, a nice number of you. That's terrific. Interestingly, the museum is the third largest one in the world. After Washington, D.C. and Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, it's our museum in Skokie. So I'm so pleased that you have been there. Hopefully some of your student groups get up there as well. So as you can see, the title of my talk this evening is The Dilemma of Jews in Germany in the 1930s, to stay or to go, and the consequences of that. Now, Debbie introduced me as Ethan Bensinger, but that's not really my name. My name is Eitan Benjamin. Now, a little more about the last name Benjamin in just a little while, but let me tell you something about the name Eitan. Eitan is a Hebrew name. I was born in Israel, in a part of the world to which my parents emigrated in 1935, which at that time it was still called Palestine under the British Mandate. But for simplicity's sake, I'll just continue to call it Israel during the course of my presentation. Now, when I've given talks in the past, some people have asked me, your parents left Germany? We thought that all German Jews were killed by the Nazis. And the answer, ladies and gentlemen, to that is no. So if there's anything that I want to have you take away from today's presentation, and there are many things, but this is the first one, is that though the Nazi period culminated in the murder of 6 million Jews, it also created what's known as a Jewish diaspora, the dispersion of Jews from Germany around the world. So in the 30s, Jews were able to come to America if they had a sponsor here. If someone gave what's known as an affidavit of support, which was part of the visa process, and it's no different today to come legally into America with an affidavit of support and a visa. Some were able to go to South America, to Brazil, to Argentina, to Colombia, to Bolivia. 17,000 were able to flee to Shanghai, a city in China which during the war was under control of the Japanese. And some made it to Palestine, as my parents and grandparents did. Now, for some family members, it was an easy decision to stay or to leave Germany. For my mother, as you'll learn in a few moments, it was a relatively easy decision. She was young. She was what's called a Zionist. In other words, believed in the establishment of a state for the Jewish people. For her parents, who were older, it was a more difficult decision. Her father fought in World War I. He considered himself a true German, secondarily a Jew. He felt Hitler was a political phenomenon that would blow over. So they ultimately left, but at the very last moment, as we'll see in a few minutes as well. And then there are those so many relatives that couldn't get out and were swallowed up by the Nazi killing machine. And I'll tell you their story as well. Now, taking my immediate family's experience, I'd like to discuss with you this evening the 4 motivating factors that people consider to leave their country of birth or residence. And these would apply in other circumstances in other countries today, but these are the factors that my family considered in deciding whether to stay in Germany or to leave. Fear, vilification, in other words, being humiliated, bullied, name-called, necessity, really time to leave, and in better times, economic opportunity elsewhere. So let's start with reason number 1, fear. And let me introduce you to my grandparents, Ida and Herman Bensinger. Herman was born in a small town by the name of Bodersweier in southern Germany, very close to the Rhine River, just across from the larger town of Strasbourg in France. My grandfather was one of 16 children, but his forefathers lived in this town of Bodersweier since the 1700s. So our family has roots that go back to Germany to the 1700s. Come on in. Good. Take your time. In 1809, Germany was not the Germany we know today. Today it's a unified country. In the 1700s, 1800s, Germany was divided into states. The state that my family lived in was called Baden, B-A-D-E-N. And each of these states were governed by a king or a duke. Well, the duke in Baden in 1809 decreed that all Jews living under his jurisdiction who didn't have a German last name had to change their last name. We had a Hebrew last name, Benjamin, comes from the Bible, one of the 12 tribes. So our family changed their name, as we were told to do, to a German last name, and they took the last name of Bensinger. Now, as I indicated, my grandfather was one of 16, and here's a family photo from 1903 with my great-grandparents there sort of in the middle. It's the wedding of a daughter. My grandfather, the wise Alec he was, that's where I got my personality from, is hiding behind the rose bush there. But that was the family in Germany. Now, my great-grandfather was a cattle dealer, and that's a vocation that many German Jews in southern Germany undertook. But my grandfather Herman didn't want to stay in the cattle dealing business. So Herman moved to the big city, Frankfurt. He moved there with his brother Louis, and they started a textile business, and Herman married my grandmother Ida. Not soon thereafter, I should say, my father Ernest was born in 1908. My grandfather Herman fought in World War I. He was a Jew. He fought next to Catholics and Protestants, all the men fought together in World War I. Could he then have imagined that less than 20 years later, that the men he would fight with would turn against him and the Jews and try to exterminate them? After the war, the textile business thrived. Offices were opened in Berlin, in London, in Danzig, in Frankfurt. And in 1929, my grandfather decided to move the business and the home from Frankfurt to Berlin. And the family became members of a thriving upper middle class community in Berlin. They had a large house with help, a chauffeur for the car, fine furniture, beautiful artwork. They attended concerts, they attended the opera. Sometimes they would attend the synagogue in Berlin, but they always had a Christmas tree for the household help. My grandparents were assimilated Jews into German society. They were first German, secondarily Jewish. And then the world began to change. In 1933, Hitler became chancellor, and events took over quickly to provoke fear in the lives of my grandparents. To commemorate Hitler's rise to power in January 1933, there were torchlight parades throughout Berlin. And my grandmother lived till 99, so I knew her as an adult and heard her stories. She only died in 85. My grandmother used to tell me she used to stand on the balcony of their home and she could hear Hitler speak to these massive crowds. She would see the brown shirts marching through the streets of Berlin, saluting Hitler, the buildings festooned with banners with swastikas. In February of 1933, just a few weeks after becoming chancellor, the Nazis set fire to the Reichstag, their Capitol building in Berlin, trying to create a crisis atmosphere. At the same time, Jews walking the streets of Berlin began to be assaulted because they had big noses or curly hair. Their neighbors would call the police, saying, "We think there's some suspicious activity going on next door." The police would come, drag Jews out of their homes, and throw them into Berlin's notorious prisons. In March of 1933, the Dachau concentration camp opened for political dissidents of the Nazi Party, both Jews and non-Jews alike. In April 1933, the Nazis called for a boycott of all Jewish businesses in Germany, directly affecting my grandfather's business in Berlin. And then, 4 weeks later, the Nazis staged book burnings throughout the country. And again, my grandparents saw the book burning in Berlin, where the books of Jewish authors and other authors that the Nazis considered degenerate were thrown into bonfires. As you can see, events moved very, very quickly. So within 6 months of Hitler's rise to power in January of 1933, my grandparents' life had changed. They could no longer venture outside safely. They couldn't conduct their lives in a normal way. I'm just going to get a little water, excuse me. Fearful for their safety, my grandparents in October of 33, just 10 months after Hitler came to power, made the most fateful and difficult decision of their lives, and that was to leave Germany. They closed their business. They sold their house for just pennies on the dollar. They sold their artwork. Some they were able to take with. Most they sold for pennies on the dollar. They said goodbye to friends, to relatives, to household staff, and they left for the desert because that's what Palestine was in those days. They moved from the leafy streets of Berlin, from a gorgeous house, to a cinder block house that was built for new immigrants outside of Tel Aviv among the sand dunes. Put yourselves in their shoes, ladies and gentlemen. If you feared for your safety, could we decide within a matter of months to leave a country that we called home for over 200 years? My grandparents were almost like the Mayflower. 200 plus years is a long time. Could we do what they decided to do? But they had the foresight to do so. Other relatives did not. And soon you'll hear their stories. And even before my grandparents left Germany, they sent my father to Amsterdam and Holland, thinking he could start a life for himself in Holland. Okay? Just as Otto Frank brought from Frankfurt his daughter Anne Frank and their family from Germany to Holland, so did my father go to Holland. His stay there was a very short one, realizing that Holland would not be a refuge for Jews. The Bensingers left Germany in fear of the Nazi regime. Now let's look at the second reason, the second motivating factor to stay or to leave. And that is vilification, humiliation, bullying, name-calling. My mother, Rachel, was born in 1912 in a small town just north of Frankfurt by the name of Fulda, F-U-L-D-A. Fulda is a charming town yet today. It has an old town medieval center with half-timbered houses. It's a very Catholic town. It's the seat of the bishop. And in fact, my mother attended a Protestant school in Fulda. Not a secular school, not a public school, not a Jewish school. And she had Jewish and non-Jewish friends with whom she got along splendidly until her late teens in the late 1920s. She had a very happy childhood until the non-Jewish friends started calling her names. My mother had wavy, curly hair, and they would call her a Jewess, a derogatory term for a Jewish woman. Whoops, that didn't move. There she is. The name calling got worse, and my mother felt ridiculed, humiliated, and stigmatized for who she was. My mother and her other Jewish friends during that time joined a Jewish youth group. They read the works of Jewish authors such as Theodor Herzl and others. They sang Hebrew songs, they did the prayers, and they became believers in the political concept called Zionism, the establishment of a homeland for the Jewish people back in their biblical homeland, Palestine. Because she was vilified, my mother felt she had no future in Germany. She was young, she could start a new life. Her parents, my grandparents, Tekla and Willie, and by the way, Tekla was a homemaker, Willie was a salesman of agricultural equipment. They were a lower middle class family in Fulda. And interestingly, my grandfather, my mother used to tell me, never once in his life stepped into a synagogue. He was not a religious man, and after work, he would prefer to sit in the local cafe and play cards with his Christian friends rather than perhaps on a holiday going to the synagogue. But we'll learn in a moment how those relationships, more likely than not, were able to help him. In any event, my grandparents in Fulda thought my mother was crazy. Going to the land of sand, leaving a cultured civilization such as Germany. My grandfather said, I'm a German. I fought in World War I. They're not going to touch me. This is political nonsense. Hitler's going to blow over. We'll be just fine. My mother knew better. In 1935, she left Germany and boarded a boat in Italy and made her way to Palestine. And on the boat, she met my father, who was returning to Palestine from a vacation. He had moved there the year before from Amsterdam, finding refuge in Palestine. My parents married in Tel Aviv in 1936 and started a textile business in Palestine together with my father's parents, Ida and Herman, who you met a little earlier, who had gone to Palestine just a few years earlier in 1933. My parents and grandparents were safe. However, storm clouds were building in Germany in 1937 and in 1938. For Jews, it was getting from bad to worse. My mother, who was in Palestine, saw what was happening and wrote to her parents, "It's time to leave. Come to Palestine." Again, her grandfather would say, "No, nothing is going to happen to us." And then came Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. And by the way, ladies and gentlemen, in just a few weeks, we're going to be commemorating the 80th anniversary of Kristallnacht. On November 9th and 10th, 1938, Germans, ordinary citizens, as well as plainclothes members of the SS and the police, rampaged through German villages, towns, large cities. 7,000 windows of Jewish businesses were smashed. In Berlin, the glass was ankle deep on the sidewalks. From those images, the name, the Night of Broken Glass, or Kristallnacht, was derived. 250 synagogues were set on fire throughout Germany. 30,000 Jewish men were forced out of their homes at dawn by the police, put onto trucks and then trains, and sent to concentration camps, Dachau being one of them. The Nazis came knocking on my grandparents' Willie and Tekla's door in Fulda on November 9th, looking for my grandfather, hoping to arrest him. They had escaped just 2 days earlier. Very likely, my grandfather was tipped off by one of his non-Jewish friends with whom he for so many years played cards with in the local cafe. They were lucky. They got out at the very last moment and made their way to Palestine, where my grandparents were able to live out the rest of their lives in safety. However, my father's cousin, back in the little town in southern Germany where the Bensingers came from, called Bodersweier, my father's cousin was not so lucky on Kristallnacht. There was a neighbor who saw what was happening, a non-Jewish person, and after the war told a local historian the following. The SS entered the house of Edward and Elsa Bensinger. He tried to resist being taken, but was carried out of the house by the collar of his shirt. His wife Elsa held on to him and yelled that he should not be taken away. She was brutally separated from her husband by the SS officers and was thrown violently onto the floor. Edward and other members of the Bensinger family and Jews from Baden and Jews from all over Germany that night, making up 30,000 Jewish men, were carted off to the concentration camps. Edward would be in Dachau for the next 2 months. He, like so many others, came home a broken man. 2 years later, on October 22nd, 1940, Edward, his wife, all the other Bensinger family members from Bodersweier, and all the Jews from the state of Baden were deported by the Germans to France, to an internment camp at the foot of the Pyrenees Mountains called Gurs. I think I pressed the wrong button. Called Gurs, Gurs. Now, ladies and gentlemen, Gurs was not a death camp. It didn't have gas chambers, but people died in Gurs from malnutrition, from rampant illnesses, from the cold and snow and wind that came through the barracks. Typically, it was the elderly that died in Gurs. Edward, no doubt, having experienced Dachau's concentration camp, knew what lay ahead of him, and he wasn't going to go back to any other concentration camp. My father's cousin Edward committed suicide in Gurs, leaving his wife Elsa and their son Julius to be deported to Auschwitz and immediately sent to the gas chambers upon arrival. My father had another cousin at Gurs by the name of Martha. Martha also came from the town of Bodersweier. Her sister was not deported because her sister was married to a non-Jew, and for that reason would not be deported. But Martha, her mother and grandmother, undertook that long train ride through France to Gurs. Now, Martha wrote a letter which survives to this day to her sister back in Bodersweier, saying, "Please send us a package, food, clothing, as quickly as possible. Maybe the day will come where we will see each other again. Mama and I are so homesick." But it would not be. Martha's grandmother, Fanny Bensinger, died in Gurs shortly after arrival at the age of 84. Martha's mother, Augusta Bensinger, died in Gurs at the age of 59. Martha was 32. She was strong. She survived the illnesses and the starvation and the cold at Gurs, only to be deported on September 9th, 1942, to Auschwitz on train number 29. The Nazis were very good record keepers, by the way, and all these records are available today. We know what day people left, what train they were on, and more likely than not, when they were killed. Though it became necessary to leave Germany, whether to leave or to stay was not an easy question to answer. Some, as we saw, like my mother, who was a Zionist and young, had the ability to leave, the wherewithal to get the hell out of there. Her grandparents, as we saw, Willie and Tekla, were able to leave at the very last minute. Some decided to stay to take care of aged parents and grandparents. And a case in point is my grandmother Tekla's brother Hugo, who was a tailor in his father's men's clothing store in Fulda. When Hugo's father, Jacob, became ill in the 1930s, Hugo decided to care for his father. When his father died, it was then too late for Hugo to leave Germany. Hugo was deported from Fulda on December 8th, 1941. Here is a partial list of the Jews deported from Fulda on that day Hugo's name is yellow highlighted. Fulda's Jewish community had gotten word of their upcoming deportation 2 weeks earlier. They were given an order of evacuation. All able-bodied men and women over younger than 65 were ordered to pack a small suitcase with a blanket, shoes, eating utensils, and food provisions, they were told, to last them for a 5 or 6 days journey. December 8th was cold and snowy, and the Jews of Fulda were forced to march down the main street of the town to the local train station, where they were relieved of all of their personal possessions, their watches, their jewelry, their money, and with their one suitcase or a knapsack or a bag, they were, and that's an actual picture from that day of the deportation. They were placed on a train that took them on a not very long ride to a city in Germany called Kassel, Kassel. Kassel was a gathering point for all the Jews from that region of Germany. And the next day, 1,000 Jews were placed into rail cars. And for days on end, in a sealed rail car, without ventilation, without sanitary conditions, without food, stacked one against another, standing up, they were shipped to the ghetto in Riga, which is Latvia today. Upon arrival, they were forced out of the rail cars, marched to a local ravine in a forest, and machine gunned to death. Hugo's date of death is unknown. However, what we do know are the names and dates of the citizens of Fulda, the non-Jews, who bought at auction the furniture and personal belongings that the Jews had to leave behind. And again, the good record keepers that the Nazis were, a sheet of names of people and what they bought. So we saw from Hugo's experience that people couldn't leave or chose not to leave because they were caring for elderly parents or grandparents, and then it became too late. Others couldn't leave because they themselves were ill or perhaps handicapped. My grandfather Herman, back in the town of Bodersweier, you recall, he had 15 siblings. He had a sister, Elsa, who was either mentally retarded or had some other mental illness, and she spent most of her life in an institution and also in a nursing home. Elsa became part of the Nazis' program of euthanasia. The Nazis decided in the 30s that Jews and non-Jews alike who were physically disabled or mentally disabled did not deserve to live, that they be euthanized. And in fact, in 1940, Elsa was brought from the nursing home in a gray bus with blacked out windows to a castle in southern Germany called Grafeneck, on the grounds of which the Nazis had built a rudimentary shack with a prototype gas chamber, identical to the one to be used 2 years later in Auschwitz. Immediately upon arrival, Elsa and the other mentally disabled individuals from the bus were led into the shack. They were told they would take a shower. It was gas, and they were euthanized. Though Israel became a refuge for my parents and grandparents and many other Jews from Germany, nevertheless, in World War II, the Nazis were at their doorstep. Armored columns under General Rommel were coming through North Africa, Morocco, Algeria, Egypt, on their way to Palestine. And in fact, the Italians that had joined the Nazi effort bombed Tel Aviv, where my parents and grandparents were living. But in time, World War II came to an end. But the struggle in Israel continued. And on May 15th, 1948, Israel declared itself an independent nation. And on that day, 5 Arab countries surrounding the new Jewish state attacked Israel. The War of Independence would go on. Both my parents fought in the War of Independence. And ultimately, the Jews defeated the Arab countries. And today, Israel is a prosperous and thriving nation. I was born in 1949, just 1 year after the creation of the state. I joined my brother, who was born 11 years earlier. But in 1955, my parents decided to come to America. My dad was offered a job in the United States, and this is the last motivating factor that people consider in deciding to leave their place of residence or birth. In better times, economic opportunity calls. So, on the shores of America at Lake Michigan in the early 60s, here is my grandmother Ida, Herman's wife. Herman died in Israel, my dad, and my mom. My dad only lived for another few years. My mom would become an occupational therapist for the next 25 years, working with the elderly in nursing homes, as well as at the self-help home for the aged, which was a refuge for survivors of the Holocaust. Indeed, my grandmother became a resident at self-help as well, living there till the age of 99. I grew up in Chicago, went to law school, got married, had 2 wonderful children, 4 grandchildren, and upon my retirement, decided to make a movie about the Holocaust, which I filmed at the self-help home called Refuge. And I left a copy of the DVD with Vicki today. You can see it, you can borrow it here at the library. You can see it online as well on our website. My mother lived at Self-Help after she retired from being a social worker. And she lived there until the young age of 102. And here's a picture of our family. Unfortunately, my brother, who was a professor of criminal justice at Loyola University for over 40 years, passed away by that time. But members of his family, my girls, the first grandchild, Ella, there crying, and my mom there at the age of 101. So you learned today that my grandparents and parents were faced with the most important decision of their lives, and they decided and they were able to leave Germany. They prospered in Israel. They prospered in the United States. Our family grew. But we also learned that when it became necessary to leave, many, many members of our family were not able to do so. And in fact, 40 members of our family were killed during the Holocaust. And that's my presentation, and I welcome comments, questions from you, and thank you for being such good guests, being so attentive, and I appreciate you being here. Thank you very much. So we have Vicki with a microphone.
If anybody wants to ask a question, we prefer that you ask in a microphone because we're recording this. So who's got a question?
I find your program very inspirational. And my question to you is, how do you feel when people say that the Holocaust never existed?
Well, you know, the word fake news is such a popular term today, and I hate to trivialize a statement like that. We have professors who taught at Northwestern University who were adherents to that concept of deception, that the Holocaust didn't happen. They only have to listen to survivors, people I interviewed, or the 52,000 people that Steven Spielberg interviewed and that can be seen online, or they have to go to Auschwitz or the other camps. The evidence is spread out there. Soon the last survivors will no longer be with us. That's why it's the second generation, of course, that takes their place.
I know General Eisenhower ordered that pictures be taken.
Yes.
Because he said someday people would say it didn't exist.
Exactly. You are so right. Thank you for that comment. Yes, Debbie.
I just wonder, I know you talked about your grandparents having memories. I'm always haunted by how did this happen in a country that was so civilized and cultured as Germany? Was it because there was economic problems, or what did your grandparents and parents say about that?
Well, we know from history that when the Germans were forced to sign the Versailles Treaty, that they felt they were not treated fairly by the big powers. They had to pay tremendous reparations. Then there was a depression and a devaluation in Germany of the Deutschmark. So there were significant economic problems. And then you had a figure like Hitler, who was, very charismatic. And the Germans bought into it. And all of a sudden there would be cartoons or caricatures of Jews as rats. And the line in Germany was, the Jews are vermin. They're bringing disease. We need to get rid of these rats. So, people bought into this concept. And it sort of was a drip, drip, drip. The Nazis didn't wake up one day and say that the Jews are going to be exterminated. It started with this vilification of Jews. It then went on to discrimination and disenfranchisement. Then it went to these boycotts that I showed you the pictures of. And then the violence of Kristallnacht. So it built up. And that's why it's so dangerous today. And that's why we try to teach our kids the consequences of bullying and name-calling, because we know it can escalate from that to something far greater over time. Thank you, Debbie, for that good question.
Is there another question?
What did that furniture sell for in those,
I'm sorry, I can't hear.
that furniture that was sold?
Yes.
Did it give the price that people paid?
On the list, the prices are on the list. Very, very inexpensive prices. Again, the economic situation wasn't a good one in Germany, so people couldn't afford much. But the point was, we don't know the date of death of my grandmother's brother Hugo, but we do know the date when the surviving people in Fulda bought his furniture and the furniture of other Jews that were deported from the town. So, yes, their names, their dates, the type of furniture, it's all there.
Was anything returned to your family?
Nothing was returned. Nothing was returned. Thankfully, my grandparents, who left in 1933, were able to take some pieces of art and furniture with them. And in fact, I have a piece of furniture at home and also a piece of art that stood in my grandparents' home in Berlin. And its value is priceless, of course. It means so much. It's their life that is no longer there today. Yes, please, sir.
So you became an immigration attorney.
I did.
And I wonder how all of this history led to that and what kind of volunteer work you're doing now.
Sure. Immigration, I guess, was in my blood because my family had a history. I was a refugee child coming to the United States. It sort of became almost a natural vocation for me, and also because I spoke and do speak German, I was able to get involved in immigrant communities. What I do today, besides traveling the world with my film, I'm going to Germany for the 5th year in a row to teach the lessons of the Holocaust to German students in schools. I tell this story that you heard today. I show my film. We've also traveled with this film to other parts of the world, to Hong Kong, to Croatia, to Israel, to France, teaching the lessons of the Holocaust. I'm also a member of an organization called CASA, Court-Appointed Special Advocates, working in the juvenile justice system, where I am the eyes and ears of a juvenile court judge. There are, of course, social workers that work with the young people, but the files on their desks are yay high, so they always look for volunteers, typically retired individuals that would be assigned to one child and would get to know the child, his foster family, go to meetings at schools, etc., and write reports several times a year to the judge as to the progress of the child that's in the juvenile justice system. So that's one of the things I do. And I have a great time babysitting my 4 grandchildren. We moved from the city of Chicago to be near them in Deerfield. And now, it's like the Old Town Boaters Wire. My kids and grandkids are in walking distance to us. And maybe it's that way here in Kankakee, that you have your families close. That isn't necessarily the case in the big city of Chicago. So we're happy to be in Deerfield near our grandchildren. So, and my wife recently retired from a career at Baxter Healthcare. So between babysitting, we also love traveling. And so we stay busy. I'll be 70 in a few months, so we want to take advantage of our health and travel while we can. Thanks for that question. Yes, ma'am.
I'm Jewish, and my family, some members of my family were killed. And the problem I'm having now, right now, are the immigrants who are walking through Mexico. I understand that they aren't necessarily legal and they don't have the papers to come into America, but it still breaks my heart to see the marching of families through the cities. And I just wondered if you had any comments about that, or anything that we should do in America to help them.
We should talk to our president and increase the number of refugees that we take into this country, rather than decreasing the number. And I'm thinking for a moment of the Syrian refugees, by the way. We've only taken in 1,200 Syrian refugees. Germany 2 years ago decided to take in 1 million refugees. Yes, that's causing political problems for Angela Merkel, and their relocation hasn't been, 100% successful. But there are countries in the world, and we used to be that way. We used to be the beacon of hope for refugees. We had a sad history during World War II when Jewish refugees were not permitted to enter America. There's an excellent movie called The Story of the St. Louis. This is a ship that made its way from Germany to Cuba with 900 German refugees, thinking they had valid visas for Cuba. In fact, they didn't. The Cubans wouldn't let them in. This ship made it to the shores of America. They could see the lights of Miami, and President Roosevelt, under the pressure of Congress, said, no, you're not entering the United States. The ship went back to Europe. Thankfully, the captain of the ship, who was a German himself, had the good heart and the foresight to deposit Jews in France and in the Netherlands before returning the ship to Hamburg. So, about 600 Jews ultimately perished when France and Belgium were occupied and the Netherlands were occupied by the Nazis. 300 were saved. So we as a country haven't had the best of records when it comes to refugees. But here we have these struggling people in Syria. We have people who are under duress from Central America. What's happening to them in Honduras isn't necessarily making the news. We hear that there are gangs killing husbands and children. The pictures aren't like they are of the barrel bombs that Assad is dropping on his people. Maybe if we further understood what's happening in South America, our hearts would be perhaps a little more open to these people. So I know it's a political issue. Do we want to let 1,000 people in that may not or may have hardship? I don't have the answer, but I'd like to see at least America opening its arms to refugees who have a legitimate claim for asylum in this country, rather than just a handful of people. You know, this is not the America that it should be when it comes to refugees. And I speak as a refugee and our own family's experience and that of other Jews and your experience as well. Thank you.
Did the families get the profits from selling their stuff at the auction that you showed?
The money was raised, the furniture was sold, and the money was kept, in this case, by the city of Fulda. No funds were ever returned to the survivors of the victims. Now, having said that, the German government in 1952 initiated a reparations program for German Jews that survived the war. If they could claim that their house was taken away from them, furniture was taken away, if they could come up with a legitimate claim, the German government did have this program of reparations. And so that was in part helpful. But with respect to any particular furniture that was auctioned, the answer was no. But on a broader scale, the Germans did have this program called Wiedergutmachung, trying to make good again. Austria and Poland did not do that, so I gotta hand it at least to the German government to try to compensate individuals that either had a physical problem based on their stay in a concentration camp if they survived, or if they were able to show that they have a house which was taken away from them.
What would constitute a legitimate claim? A lot of their paperwork was lost.
And that was one of the real problems. That was one of the real problems. On the other hand, the Germans were very good record keepers, and even though a lot of the records were destroyed in the bombings of the German cities, some records did survive. Jewish families would hire attorneys in Germany to try to find these records. So yes, an effort was made, at least by the German government, if you could establish a claim, is to pay something for your loss. Yes, sir.
I grew up in Germany in a small town, Miltenberg on the Main River, which is like 50 miles southeast of Frankfurt. And in my family, it's like my mother grew up. Her best friend was Hilde Halle, and they were Jewish. In 1933, they moved to Venezuela, Caracas, and they had a store in Miltenberg, and it was basically, I think 1933, I don't know whether they were compensated for it or not, but they left already early, 1933. The ominous 1933 year. When Hilde Halle came after the Second World War, she came in 1956. She came to my hometown, and we were living up on the hill more, and she said she wouldn't dare to go to town because she might meet somebody who she knew who hated her, and then she went to Würzburg where she studied, and it was a very painful for her to come back. And my grandfather was a high school teacher in town, and he was already retired. And after the Second World War, the American government made him the principal of the high school because he was like a sympathizer.
Yep.
And did some. So, and when you talk about Bundesweiler, when you say Strasbourg, right across from Strasbourg is Kiel am Rhein.
Ja, genauso, ja.
Genauso. And I went to Freiburg, University of Freiburg.
I've been to Freiburg. It's a wonderful town.
Not wunderschön, yeah. Das Beste, yeah. So I have stories to tell. But growing up after the Second World War as a German, as a youth, you didn't hear anything. I mean, you might have, there were people who might have been the parents, big Nazis, but you didn't know.
Yeah.
You had no idea. So there were the good and the bad, and especially in small towns, when you come back and you study a little bit, it's interesting.
Yeah, yeah. That I find it so interesting when I talk to students in the German schools. I've gone now back to the same schools over these years, and we always show the film to a new 8th grade class, but sometimes students that heard me speak the year before come up to me and they say they've taken the opportunity now to finally speak to their parents or grandparents who never said anything to them. And, it's facilitating conversations. But, there's a parallel to this. And that is when the survivors came to America, they also didn't speak about their past and their history. They were traumatized. They wanted to start a new life. In the 70s, there was a TV show that was ultimately broadcast around the world called Holocaust. It was a 5-night show. And this really started a conversation among families and survivors. And that's when the Holocaust museums started getting survivors willing to speak at schools and before organizations. So, yes, so there's a parallel. In Germany, they didn't want to talk about the past. When the survivors came to America, for a good 25 years, they didn't want to talk about the past. I was about 50 or so when my mother finally told me our family history. She thought it's finally time that I'm now an adult and that I finally learn what happened to our family. Before that, the word always was, we got out, Oma and Opa, the grandparents got out, everything was fine. Only later did I learn about uncles, aunts, brothers, sisters, cousins. Yeah. Yes, sir.
How do you assess?
He's got you.
How do you assess the status of Jews in Germany today and elsewhere in the world? And could you comment on the neo-Nazi movement that's present?
Germany has become home in the last 25, 30 years for Jews from Russia. After Gorbachev opened the gate to the emigration of Jews, permission was finally granted for them to leave Russia. Many came to America, others settled in Germany. They've built lives for themselves there. Berlin has also become, for some inexplicable reason, home for about 5,000 young Israelis. Okay? Things were pretty good in Germany until this last year when a new right-wing political party called the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland, Alternative für Deutschland, now has a large number of seats in the German parliament. And this is a right-wing party, similar to the party that has grown under Premier Orban in Hungary, similar to the right-wing party that you now find in Poland, which also has become home again to some Jews. So I would say in the last couple of years, the situation for Jews in places like Poland and Hungary and Germany, where they thought because there was a vestige of democracy there, they would feel secure, I don't think they no longer feel as secure as they did just a few years ago. The situation in France, where there are about 500,000 Jews, is also a difficult one. Religious Jews, the Orthodox, no longer feel comfortable walking through many parts of Paris with a skull cap on. Jews have been beat up because they look like Jews. Many French Jews have moved to Israel in the last 10 years or so. So I see the situation for Jews as a precarious one in Europe today. They shouldn't feel as secure as they once did. There's always anti-Semitism in the world, and there's always neo-Nazism, and if the political environment permits the growth of that type of thinking, you will have hatred of Jews. You know, some of you know the name Soros. He's been in the news. Soros is a former Hungarian. He and his parents survived the Holocaust in Budapest. In this last election in Hungary, Soros's image was plastered all over the country. Okay? Everyone knows the name Soros as being a Jewish name in Hungary. So Orban was using anti-Semitism there. And the word was that it was Soros's money that was permitting the migration of refugees from the Middle East into Hungary. So you have this rise of anti-Semitism again, unfortunately. Yes, please.
That same perspective, I'm using that with quotes, it's Soros's money that is now funding the caravan that's coming up from Central America. It's, and if you listen to the right-wing talk radio, you've talked about Europe and Hungary and Poland, but it's not so different here currently, and I worry. And when I was a practicing attorney, I cannot tell you how many clients would come to me. It wasn't every client or majority, but there were a number over the years who said, I want you to be my lawyer because I know you're going to Jew them down. All right? So it's here as well.
Well, we can certainly have a very long discussion how fearful many Jews are in America today, especially after the images that we saw on TV of Charlottesville, with people marching with torches saying Jews will not replace us, and the growing desecration of Jewish cemeteries, swastikas on synagogues. Jews historically have been scapegoats, and people say it can as easily happen here under some circumstances as it happened elsewhere. So there certainly is a level of concern among elements of the Jewish community that things could easily get out of hand here.
I thought that when people went to Israel.
Who's talking? Oh, hi.
When,
Use your microphone, please.
when people immigrated from Germany to Israel, I thought they couldn't get in easily.
Oh, you're a good student of history, by the way. During the time of the British Mandate in 1939, the British imposed what's known as the White Paper, restricting the immigration of Jews into Palestine. And that continued to after the war. So you would have Jews in displaced person camps in Germany that would try to illegally board ships and try to get into Palestine. The British blockade would capture these ships and bring these Jewish refugees who suffered so much in Auschwitz and other camps and put them behind barbed wire in Cyprus. Cyprus was a holding pen for Jews who tried to get to their homeland in the 30s before the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. So you're a good student of history, and I congratulate you for that. Use your microphone, please.
How did your grandparents and parents get in there?
That was before. In 33, there was still open immigration at that point in time because it was a trickle. After Kristallnacht in 38, where Jews wanted to leave Germany as quickly as possible and try to get anywhere in the world, that's when the numbers increased into Palestine, and the British bought into the Arab oil interests and decided that the British future lay with the Arabs and not with the Jews, and we're going to restrict Jewish immigration. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Nancy. You go after Nancy.
I lived in Germany for 3.5 years in the late 60s with the military, and because our troops had left France, there wasn't enough military housing, so we lived in some little villages, and maybe 300, 400 people and this was in the late 60s, 4 or 5 phones in the whole village. If I was a German in the 40s and I didn't agree with Hitler, I don't know that I would have had the courage to speak up, because I probably would have been killed too. I just finished reading Auschwitz, and the doctor there was a Jew. And he worked because he knew that he was eventually going to be killed. With all of the social media we have today, things just go crazy. But back then, there wasn't all that communication, and
Right.
I don't know, there were probably many people that were against what Hitler did, but I don't know that I would have had the courage to speak up.
I understand. Thank you for your comment.
I had a question about the diaspora, and you partially answered it talking about Israel in Cuba. I'm wondering how some of the other countries accepted the refugees, and specifically, how did so many end up going to Shanghai?
Interestingly, even though the Japanese were allied with Hitler, they did not buy into his policy of extermination. They ruled Shanghai, and they had no visa or medical restrictions. So anybody who could make their way to Shanghai was permitted to enter that city by the Japanese. Okay? There's
What about
Other stories also, the Japanese consul general in Lithuania, also there's a book and a movie about him. His name is Shigura. He gave Jews basically phony transit visas that they could traverse from Europe through Russia and China to South America and to other parts of the world. So there were a lot of good people that were in diplomatic positions. You may know the name of Raoul Wallenberg, the Swede. There were many, I shouldn't say many, there were people who helped Jews in Europe trying to get out, and many were successful.
Okay, thank you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you again for being such a good audience, for having such stimulating questions.